our guest today is Russell Taylor. Everyone knows who I am. I'm going to be the host of our Perspectives Live event today, and this is an ongoing series. It does not cost anyone anything. It's we love to bring people together from the industry to have a conversation, typically about technology, where technology intersects traditional finance. And Russell is a fintech executive, board advisor, consultant, and currently CEO of Finovi. Did I say Finovi right?
Finovifi.
Finovi.
Finovifi, yeah, president of Finovifi.
Finovi. And that's in AI-powered fraud. I think you do core and compliance solutions. I think I captured all
Yeah,
that.
you got that right.
Yeah, and super excited to talk about fraud, check fraud. I know check fraud's a big component of it. Anything that you want. We're just gonna have an open conversation today. If anyone on the chat has questions, feel free to throw them in there. Victoria's monitoring that chat for us, so she'll get the questions answered. And then also, if anyone wants to come off mute and talk, kind of talk live, just let Victoria just put something in the, raise your hand or put something in the chat, and we'll do that. And again, we're going to be talking, I think we're talking today, fraud, check fraud. And I was thinking about fraud's fascinating. I'm not an expert at fraud, certainly, unfortunately, you are, but I was thinking like fraud. I grew up in the credit card industry, so like fraud was always seemed to be a combination of there's a lot of components to fraud, right? There's like the stolen identity component, the stolen credentials. You've got physical checks, physical cards. You've got people who are like willing participants or unwittingly participants. And then I was looking at this morning some of the stats around this, and it was just mind-boggling. Postal inspectors recover more than $1 billion in counterfeit checks and money orders every year. Now that's what they're capturing, right? So you think about what gets through. NASDAQ estimated that about a little over $100 billion in payment frauds for U.S. or for America, most of it being U.S., and that was in 2023. And check losses represented of about 20 billion plus, which would be about a quarter of payment-related fraud, which is a huge amount of money. And then what's even more concerning is LexisNexis Risk Solutions did a study in 2024 to try to figure out the true cost of fraud. And they found, and this is something I hadn't really thought about, but that they found that for every $1 lost in fraud costs, cost the financial institution an additional $4.41 in accounting for direct losses, fines, fees, investigation costs. And that doesn't even consider the cost, the reputational cost of that. And case in point, Regions Bank, I think it was 2023, but they had, and this was just specific to check fraud, they recorded a $135 million loss from check fraud in 2023. So that worked out to approximately a little over 4% of their total non-interest expense. That's mind-boggling that there's that much check fraud out there. And I imagine part of it's because it's kind of an older, antiquated technology. It's surprising that people still write checks, but yet I do as well. And fraudsters are always this kind of cat and mouse game, right, where they're always going to the easiest solution. And so, super excited to hear you talk about fraud today, check fraud. Who's behind this stuff? Are these gangs? Are these individuals? What tools are they using? Are they out on the black market? Are people selling my check credentials? And it's crazy that I'll give you an example. Now fortunately my dad did authorize me to do this, but he gifted some money for my daughter's tuition, and he's like, yeah, you know what, you could know my check number and my ACH. Go ahead and sign up and just have them paid from my account. I'm like, okay, so I signed up and had it paid from his account. But I'm like, he didn't authorize that other than telling me that, and I just had his account number and ACH number, and sure enough, they pulled that ACH from my dad's account. And I'm like, man, that's bonkers. And I know there's fraud on that side too. I've heard recently that there's a lot of fraud related to like people buying, whether it's buying crypto or even stocks and stuff like that through the investment houses. And I wasn't aware, but like for like an ACH, if you dispute that ACH transaction, the bank basically has to take that loss on that. And it's like no questions asked or something. And I don't even know, that's probably not accurate, but I'm interested in learning all about this with you today, Russell. And I think we're going to have a really good conversation.
Well, Larry, thank you. And I'm very pleased to be on Perspective Live. I think check fraud is a real problem, and the more people can talk about it and the more awareness we can have about it and take action, the sooner we are going to be able to actually get a handle on it. It's funny, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not native to Philadelphia. Finovifi itself is headquartered in Birmingham, Alabama, and I spend a fair bit of time down there. But I came to the States about 23 years ago, and I remember at the time I've always been in banking and financial technology, and I started my career in the 90s in banking, and I remember being absolutely amazed that they still wrote out so many checks in the United States, and that checks were still so prolific. And at the time, being techno and looking at what happened in the rest of the world, I figured checks had maybe 5 years still to go. Here we are 23 years later, and we still write over 10 billion checks a year,
Yeah.
which is astronomical. I did a lot of my early career in South Africa in banking. And at the time, because we realized the risk of banks, of checks, the banks started to make checks expensive to write. So every time you made a check payment, there was a fee on the check it got to a stage of being prohibitive. But if you did an electronic transfer, we started off doing it for free to try and encourage people to actually move on there. So when you're doing payroll and you're signing 1,000 salaries, if you're doing it on EFT, we were making that free. And if you're writing a check, we were charging you a substantial amount of a check, and it would increase with the value of the check. So that really helped sort of drive the consumer behavior away from checks, because checks were that we had a fraud pandemic. So I think in the United States, you kind of fast forward to where we are today, and although the volume of checks is decreasing, the volume of check fraud is increasing astronomically. And some of the numbers that you stated earlier are quite right. It's over $25 billion worth of check fraud. And there were, I think, 682,000 suspicious activity reports registered with FinCEN on all the various check fraud, which is huge. I mean, that's a massive amount of check fraud going out. And if you divide the loss amount, the average fraudulent check's about 35 grand, which is huge. But of those FinCEN reported numbers, not all check fraud's reported. It's just there's a lot more going on there than we actually realize. And it's because I think the technology to duplicate checks has become a lot better, and the banks have not kept speed with the tools to prevent or pick up altered or forged checks. So it's a combination of issues, and it's actually quite funny if you go back and if you look at a time graph on the increase in check fraud, just after sort of COVID hit in, banks because of COVID, bankers encouraged their customers to be able to actually bank with them remotely.
Right.
So kind of wherever your phone is, there's a bank, which is fantastic for convenience, and it kept people out of the banking halls. And that makes a lot of sense from a retail banking point of view, because retail banking often, your cost of bricks and mortar is expensive. Your cost of face-to-face interaction is expensive. If you can drive people to digital channels, that's great. You don't have them in your banking halls. You can hopefully lower your operating cost to revenue ratios. The downside of that is that you lost that personal touch, and who was opening the account. And so I think it also created an opportunity at that point in time to say, well, look, there are a lot more ways to open an account. So it created an opportunity for people to earn, mule accounts or synthetic accounts where, it's some bit of real information, some fabricated information, maybe stolen identities from the dark web to open up mule accounts, because you can actually open these accounts remotely, whereas, in days gone past, it perhaps wasn't that easy.
So, Ross, our question looks like actually someone was thinking along the same lines of in there. There's a question: did South Africa start charging fees on checks? I may have missed it.
Yes, they did. And that was in the 90s. So in the early 90s, they started charging fees for checks. So you would write a check out and you would pay fees on, and the fees got higher and higher, so that they eventually added as a disincentive for people to write checks. And the reason why banks were doing that was because of check fraud, and checks lost in mail, stolen checks, and the whole check fraud. The other thing they did do, though, it wasn't just charging a fees for it. They also mandated clearing periods. So if you did send a check in, those funds would be frozen for 7 days, unless you were a high net worth customer and you'd had some banking history and you hadn't done, you hadn't ever deposited a bad check in your account before, then they would sometimes take the risk and allow you to actually draw on uncleared effects. But there were those two factors. So checks became inconvenient and they became expensive. Whereas in the States, we are very customer service driven, which is fantastic, but sometimes it's to our detriment. And you almost, in that market, you're able to you didn't have thousands of banks like we do here. You had a few major banking groups that could actually say, hey, how are we going to solve this problem? Let's, all go electronic. Let's all, make it difficult for checks. And as a result, they could, move the market on it.
Well, to that point, it's funny that in the US we've not done that, because we have done that with electronic statements, right? We used to send out physical statements, and we rarely send out physical statements anymore. We had incentives and disincentives for doing that. You almost wonder, why aren't we doing that for physical checks? But maybe that's a question for another topic.
Yeah, agreed. So you've had, so I think that's partly, is it regulatory? Is it the big banks saying, look, let's all do away with checks? You've got to be able to actually, and what makes it a bit more difficult in the United States is the fact that, you have got 4,500 community banks and maybe 5,000 credit unions. And often these are on disparate bits of technology. Their payment systems are not, readily available in a uniform fashion, across the country as they were in other parts of the world. Banking technologies are actually, a few steps behind where it is in Europe and Africa in many parts. Actually, strangely enough, tell you a story just to deviate a little bit, but we're all familiar with the Venmo as a really convenient way to extract payments. Well, the concept of stored value wallets actually came in Africa, evolved in Africa, and about 10 years before it came to the States. So M-Pesa started in Kenya to solve the problem of the fact that you didn't have a banking network and people didn't have bank accounts. So they created a stored value on a phone. And you look at the amount of transactions that happen in stored value in these emerging markets. And I think the number's over 100 transactions a month are done on their M-Pesa wallet per person on average, whereas in America, I think it's about 1.7 transactions on average for the people that use things like Venmo and everything else. So
Yeah,
far higher adoption of technology.
completely leapfrogged the US, and some of the technologies that we did just went right to electronic banking, and that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, certainly interesting. But anyway, today, so where are we today? It's obviously check fraud is a huge problem. And I think, if you look at banking, bankers are all about trust. And your relationship is all about, protecting your customers. It's about the fidelity of the funds they hold with you and your ability to be, their trusted financial partner. And when check fraud gets into the mix, when it kind of starts to sour it. And I really like the quote you made to LexisNexis. That's a fantastic study, because the real issue with check fraud is not the actual loss. It's the other loss. It's the cost of fraud mitigation, the cost of investigations. It's the erosion of trust, the reputation damage. It's the word of mouth, the bad word of mouth that actually gets spread. And if you look at how much banks spend on new customer acquisition, it's phenomenal. It's a phenomenal amount of money to acquire a new customer. And they say that, the stats, I think it was Thomson Reuters stats I was reading, they reckon that 60% of customers that undergo check fraud consider moving their banking relationship.
I've heard that.
Which is huge. So it's a very big disincentive to say, hey, if we don't take care of our customers, and it's so hard to get a customer, we could easily lose the customer. And unfortunately, the majority of banks, although they're suffering from it, very few of them are actually employing the technologies that are available today to really prevent it. And I think when you look at check fraud, it's no different to looking at security. And if you take a very simple analogy at security on your house, you may never have been broken into at home, but you still have a lock on your front door.
Yeah, and the more locks you have, and the more difficult you make it to break in, it's not that your house isn't able to be broken into. It's just that it's a harder target than the house next door.
Correct.
And that's probably the game that financial institutions need to be playing.
Yeah.
Well, because at the end of the day, you have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders and your members and customers.
Well, Larry, and it's not only that. If more banks did that, then it wouldn't be such an easy target. The reason why people are doing that, and that's because it's easy money. And it's easy money because it is a fairly antiquated way of doing payments, and the ability to pick checks up and wash them or counterfeit them or alter them in some way is pretty easy. And you don't have to search too far to find videos on how to do all of this.
Yeah, for anyone who was wondering, the picture I posted, that was not my Tupperware, nor was it a check. I had nothing to do with the washing of that check. I managed to grab that video or picture of somewhere else, but
yeah. So when you look at I suppose and how we got into Finovifi, how we got into the check fraud businesses, we were sitting down with a couple of our, not into the check fraud business, into the check fraud prevention business. We were sitting down with a couple of our bankers in 2023, and we were speaking about, what's the biggest pain point they had. And they said, look, it's check fraud.
yeah.
And, we all know that check imaging systems have been around for a long time. Over 20 years, we've had imaging systems. And how the typical imaging systems used to work is they used to have a look at your index card that you signed when you opened your bank account, however many years ago. And then they would actually look at that, signature on the check and see if it matched it. And the result was you got a lot of false positives because people's signatures change over time, and it didn't really look at any of the other sort of metrics that are available on a check. So nowadays, there's a lot more technology available that it won't just look at signatures. It'll also look at things like what's the known behavior of the account. So there's a certain amount of behavioral scoring where you'll say, Russell usually writes checks at this time and that time of the month, and his checks are usually between that amount and this amount. And so if something would actually come that's not within that, it would raise a flag. But it goes a step further, and there's certainly the technology we deploy is actually looking at things like biometric verification. So it's taking the same technology used for biometrics to scan your iris or your face or your fingerprint and applying that to be able to actually to checks to actually understand if there's been any slight alteration or change in what a standard check stock image would actually look like. Because when the fraudsters are recreating checks, are they actually, recreating the actual amount to the minuscule of a millimeter in the right place? And that gets all triangulated to be able to actually figure out whether or not, a check's been forged. And it's also looking at things like check behavior, writing behavior, alterations, handwriting styles, courtesy amount written versus legal amount recognized. But sorry, I'm jumping the gun. Getting back to where we were. So in about June 2023, we sat down with a couple of our banks and they said, this is our biggest pain point. And we had a look at the technology that was out there and we thought, that's great, but what else can be done? So we sat down with the bank and we partnered up with a company called Obergraph, and Obergraph have got an absolutely fantastic bit of forensic technology on the check imaging side. And we figured, look, if we can find this, if we can create this in a way that can actually be accessible to a lot of the community banks, and add a bit of technology in the front of it, using that imaging technology at the back of it, we should be able to actually help the banks address the challenge. So we incorporated a bit of AI and machine learning to be able to actually figure out a way forward. So we got our first customer live in about March of last year, and tested it out. And quite quickly after that, they actually had a fraudulent transaction that came in, which our system caught very quickly, and they were ecstatic about it. So we've got about 30 banks that are live now at the moment, and we've got a lot more banks that are saying, hey, how quickly can we sign up?
Russell, what's the average? And I'm sure it varies by bank, or maybe there isn't an average, but is it like a median or a mean check size that is when it is fraudulent? Is it like for $100 fraudulent, or is it $1,000 fraudulent, or $10,000 fraudulent? Like how large are these on average when they come through?
I'm not sure if I've got what an average is, but on the ones on that particular one, it was a $40,000 check that was
Wow.
actually drawn on one of the directors of the bank. So it was, someone came in to actually do, a director's check, but there's no set amount. I know that in the marketplace where they sell these checks. So I suppose there are a couple of components. First of all, we know there are fraudulent checks out there. We know there are bad guys that are actually finding these checks, but where do these checks come from? So we started a service that looked at the dark web, and we've got a team of forensic analysts that spend their days searching through the various social media platforms or messaging platforms, things like Telegram, Signal, Facebook group, WhatsApp groups. There's a whole plethora of different channels that people use to communicate that they've got some stolen checks. Because we were figuring, look, it's one thing to be able to actually find the check when it's being presented and pick up, yes, this looks like it's been altered or it's a forgery check, but where are these checks actually coming from? So we started looking, we started actually capturing information that was being sold and creating a database of it. So we've now got a database of a couple of 100,000 checks on it, and every month there are about 5,000 stolen checks that are being added into the database that are being sold on these channels. And so we go in and we actually find these images, and it's not only checks, it's title deed information, it's debit card information that are all being sold on the dark web. And then we create, we take images of those, and then we make those available to the banks to say, these are the following checks you have that are being sold on the dark web.
Russell, this is mostly, I would assume this is mostly organized gangs, right? Because I know there's a couple. I think there's a Philly-based gang called the Say Slang or a Slay Side gang that steals out of post office boxes using post office box master keys. There's a Shiesty 66 gang that I think stole millions of dollars. There's a felony lane gang that goes to multiple states and breaks into vehicles to steal checkbooks for identification. So I would assume, or maybe I'm wrong, but is the mass majority of this check fraud done by organized criminals, or is it one-offs? The gal down the street that's got a meth problem that's looking to make some money to get the next hit, washing checks. What's the individuals involved in this? And then I know they often will employ homeless folks to go ahead and look for these checks in mailboxes. And so who's involved in this kind of stuff? Is there a standard kind of an element, or is it just it's a mix?
It's a mix. You've certainly got the big gangs that are doing this on a larger scale, and they're hitting the USPS trucks. There are people involved on the inside. There are videos online that'll show you how to wash checks and how to steal checks and how to make them available. So there is a whole marketplace that exists. And a lot of the guys are so brazen that they will kind of give you a money back guarantee. So checks will actually sell for personal checks will sell anywhere from about $190 to $400 or $500, and business checks up until a couple of $1,000. But if you buy a business check, and let's say you buy a business check and it's sort of worth $10,000, and you try and deposit it and it gets caught up and it doesn't work. The guy that sold you that check has got a reputation to protect. He'll send you a replacement check, and these guys have got they've got a reputation to protect. So it is a big business. I think people, and you've got if you look at Telegram, the Telegram marketplace, or Signal, or any one of these marketplaces where they're selling this, you'll sometimes see the same checks sold by different people. So you can almost imagine you've got a kind of wholesale, retail kind of distribution model in checks, but you do very much see gangs or hot areas. We've got we call it a heat map that we actually show. So we record all the checks stolen for the last 60 days in our database, and we show the heat map, and sometimes you'll see the heat map move a little bit. Obviously, your major metropolitan areas is obviously where the majority of your check fraud is, but it drills right down, and you certainly can see movement of activity, which probably when they they usually go into different neighborhoods that haven't been hit before, and then they perhaps rob a few post boxes, mailboxes, and then they move off on again.
Who gets involved in prosecuting or going after these? I know, like with currency, it's the Secret Service, but obviously this isn't currency. The post office is often involved, so it'd be like a postal police or something. Like who actually traces or chases this down from a law enforcement standpoint?
Well, there's a Postal Police Officers Association that actually there's a gentleman by the name of Frank Albergo, who's the president of that organization. He's very, very prolific on LinkedIn, and he's championing the cause against the kind of power that's been taken away from the postal police officers, because they basically have had a lot of resources and authority stripped away from them, which has at the same time there's been this massive increase in check fraud, and so it's certainly supposed to be law enforcement that actually do it. The Postal Police Officers Association are a body that should be tasked to do it. They just haven't been, they've had a lot of the powers they had in manpower stripped away from them, and as that's happened, you've seen a huge increase in mail theft.
What and obviously depend on the size of the institution, but like most banks and credit union, like a community bank or credit union, are you talking thousands of dollars lost annually, hundreds of $1,000s, millions of dollars lost to check fraud? I mean, again, obviously dependent on how large your membership base or customer base is and those sorts of things. But like these are substantial numbers, right?
Yeah, that's substantial. And again, obviously the bigger the bank, the more the checks, the bigger the amounts, the bigger the loss.
Yeah.
So like a Regions Bank example, it can be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But if you're a small community bank, and you get a $30,000 check that happens to come from your local municipality account or local town council, you don't necessarily want to pass that on to them because you want to protect your relationship. So often the bank, obviously needs to eat those amounts, so that they are substantial. I mean, we've seen small towns with small community banks that have actually had quite significant losses, and if you're losing $30,000-$40,000, it's a lot of money.
Now I've read somewhere that businesses, and I don't know if businesses include banks and credit unions, that they can obtain basically crime and fidelity insurance to cover losses related to check fraud. Is that the financial institution that can get that insurance, or is that insurance, like if I'm a business owner and I know there's check fraud that could impact me, I get insurance for that? Who's that insurance typically for? Do you know?
Well, I think when you look at check fraud, where does the actual responsibility for the fraud actually lie? And it's usually with the bank. So the banks are the ones that actually, and it's kind of a, the onus is on the person to check their accounts every 30 days and 60 days, but the onus is really on the banks to actually pick it up. So it's the banks that actually carry the loss on it. There are, generally you could say, within 30 to 60 days, you should have reported it. Legally, if you look at the kind of UCC guidelines, I think it's up to a year that if you've noticed that something's happened, that you should be able to report on, unless it's a repeat offense. You keep on having fraudulent checks from the same person, then they may not do it. But I think the inconvenience of it is let's say I've picked up a check fraud that happened on my account, and let's say it's a significant amount of money. The bank may have the onus to say, yes, we need to actually put that back into your account, but we're going to investigate it first of all. And in the meantime, I've got my mortgage payment, I've got everything else that needs to come off, and where's that $10,000 that got stolen out of my account? I can't meet my mortgage. Suddenly, what do I do? And the bank's taking some time to investigate it. So how long does it take before that money is put back into my account? And meanwhile, I'm trying to manage that and whatever else whatever else I'm suffering from, because often these things go hand in hand with identity theft and so it's not just, hey, I've lost some money on a check. It can often be part of bigger scheme.
So in terms of checks, there's counterfeit checks, there's forged checks, and altered checks, right? There's the kind of three different kinds.
Mainly, I mean, you get, I mean, it's fraudulent checks, it's counterfeits, and it's basically check washing is probably the main one that you're seeing. And that's really where people are using, some household chemical to be able to actually remove the ink and rewrite the check. You get check counterfeits, and that's where people are using fairly sophisticated printers to be able to actually recreate the check image itself. And then obviously there are check alterations, and that's where someone's taking a check and they're altering the payee amount or payee, or they're altering the amount that's being paid. And those are quite often quite easy. You can imagine if you're writing your check to your local utility like Pico, and everybody writes Pico, PECO, and they know they've got 6 million customers. Well, open an account called Peacock, for example, and start trading in different banks for a while and let the money get up, and then steal a few thousand checks and deposit them, and your account's been in good standings because you've been trading on it. Then one day you put a load of checks in there, and a week later all the money's drawn out and people disappear.
So this check washing, funny story, not actually related to check washing, but like I'd assume it was kind of like the equivalent from a chemical standpoint of, when you had a nice shirt as a kid and you got some ink on it and you use hairspray or whatever to get the ink off. I had some this first day at work at a new bank, which was very much set on dressing like to the T, had on a nice white shirt, and I had a pen in my pocket, and it was a fountain pen, and it happened to leak the spot about the size of a quarter. And I thought, oh my God, I got to get this off. So I went in the bathroom thinking I put cold water on it and see if I could wash it through. And my quarter size spot went to something that was this.
To $1, yeah.
I ended up having to just go home and get a new shirt. But
yeah,
I can imagine the chemicals involved in doing that. Now, maybe you also talk a little bit about like digital or online banking vulnerability, right? Because even though we've got digital check, I mean, we've got physical checks now, we kind of have digital checks, and we're doing ACH deposits. So how does that work? Are you seeing fraud, or there's ways to catch fraud where, like, okay, I've got a bank, I get checks all the time, and now I remote deposit those checks. Some banks seem to be doing, and credit unions seem to do a lot better job checking to make sure that remote deposit check matches certain things. One bank in particular, local, I've had to like write all sorts of things on it and hold it in a certain way, and like for them to verify that indeed it's a check and it hasn't been represented somewhere else, something along those lines. Is there fraud in that space? Is there anything you're doing with that, or is it really just physical checks?
So when you look at remote deposit of a check, whether you're doing it at a branch teller or you're doing it through a ATM deposit, when the check is scanned in, an image of the check is actually captured, and that's actually usually what's sent to the other bank for payment. So when the Fed sends their Fed clearing letter or Fed files to each other banks, they then get that file and they then reproduce the image from an ANSI X9 file. So it's really a complicated computer algorithm file where you see just a whole lot of dots if you look at it, but when you use the tool to look at it, it'll reproduce the check. So the images are transported using that kind of technology protocol. And then what we do is we actually look at those images as they come through, and we compare it to what's known good and known bad checks. So it doesn't really matter, you know, if it's a physical written check or typed out check, it's still going to be, and it's being sent through a remote capture, it's still being scanned in the same manner, and it's still being presented in the same way. So that part of it, there's no real difference, because whether it's being captured at your at the receiving bank end, and then your bank's getting your on us files to actually check each day, it's the same thing. You're still looking at the same bit of information, and I think it's not just when you look at it, there are a whole lot of different things that newer technologies look at. It would be things like handwriting style. So I'll give you an example. On my check account, both my wife and I are signatures on my account, and the system knows my handwriting, and it knows my wife's handwriting. But it also knows that sometimes my daughter writes out checks for either one of us to sign, and so it knows her handwriting as well. Now, if suddenly a check were to be presented and it were to be typed out in Arial type font and signed by either my wife or I, it would actually flag and say, hold on 1 second, of all the checks of Russell, because it learns the behavior. All the checks Russell's ever written, we've never actually had a check like this before, so it's going to flag it. And then when the officer at the bank is looking at it, they're going to say, hold on 1 second, we've got a flag check for Russell. Well, let's look at this check and let's look at a previous check, and allow you to flag them backwards and forwards and scan to see what the variation of it is. And that's a very simple example, but really what it does is it has learned behavior. So not only does it look at your images today, but it looks at the images for your last 6 months of checks, and it consistently learns. So if your handwriting does change over time,
It does.
it starts to pick it up, and it knows that those are still acceptable and they're learned and they're normal. But if suddenly there's something that's unusual on it, it'll pick it up and say, so it's not looking at that original signature card that you signed when you opened the bank, your bank account. It's actually looking at it's getting learned behavior. So it's consistently updating what acceptable behavior is. So if there is a variation on that, it straight away picks it up on top of looking at all the other things. Yeah, mountain range, is it how you normally write your checks in terms of the amounts you normally write out? Is it the same handwriting style? Is it the same LAR and CAR amount? So any kind of alteration, if you're the right bit of technology, 99% chance it's going to be, if it picks up something that's wrong, it's really wrong.
So I know our banks aren't using your technology because my wife frequently writes my name and I frequently write her name. And we both often write our kids' names to deposit checks remotely. And we've yet to be flagged. But it's probably also one of those combinations of it's a certain size and it's a certain pattern. And
Correct.
it's family members and it's being deposited in their accounts. It'd be different if it was deposited in someone else's account. So I'm sure there's some checks there that.
Well, Larry, I suppose it becomes sort of on this learned behavior. If it's learned good checks, then it kind of learns it as good checks.
Yeah.
It learns it as acceptable, which is great, because you want to, from a banking point of view, you want to reduce your false positives, because that's all labor intensive. And the other thing that banks do is banks generally only look at checks below a certain threshold, above a certain threshold, because it's just too labor intensive. So if you're having to manually checks, I mean, we are speaking to bank the other day, and they were only looking at checks above $10,000. Like, that's crazy. Why? It's just too labor intensive. We can't put the manpower to be able to check these checks out. Well, if you put the right automated tools in, you're able to actually look at every single check. You get 1,000 checks that come through from the Fed, and instantly processes them and says, look, out of those 1,000 that you've got, we've got 4 that you need to look at, and here's why you need to look at them. It'll give you a score on each one, so you can determine your risk tolerance. But what it does, it allows you to actually then check every single check, which is what you want. And if you've got the right technology in there, you're going to be able to actually make sure that every single check gets checked, not a certain threshold of ones that you're going to look at. And that technology is available. It's just you've got to get all the banks got to work together on it.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I assume the false positives are reasonably low, because the last thing you want to do is introduce additional friction on the customer or member. So you guys are doing signature verification, real-time fraud detection. Maybe can you talk a little bit about real-time fraud detection? I think you guys are doing that. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. So if you look at the fraud detection over the counter, if someone's coming in and it's being captured, it all depends on the source of capture and how quickly you can scan the image against the system. So if you look at it all, if your fraud is coming through from a Fed letter that's coming through each day, well, It's only as real time as you actually can load the file. And if it's over the counter and it's connected to our system, it'll automatically pick it up and read it against known good and known bad. So it'll be real time from that point of view. Often depends upon how the information is being presented, but we can process it instantaneously.
That's awesome. And then in terms of identifying unusual transaction patterns, serial out of range and duplicate checks. I know what duplicate checks are. What would be a serial out of range check?
So a serial out of range, let's say that on the dark web, they're selling a check and the check's dated 2021 and it's being sold and somebody buys the check stolen 2021. They know that it's a valid account number. They know that the signatures are good on it, but they need to amend the amount. Well, that was a 2021 check, so they don't know what the serial number is going to be. So a serial out of range will be a serial number that's recorded, your check number, that's actually outside of the range of where the checks would be. So I know that I'm on check 452,
Okay.
and suddenly a check, 1022 comes up. It's like, well, that's out of range because we're missing a whole bunch of them. So it understands what your previous ranges have been. And if there's suddenly serial out of range one, or it could be a very old check that's being represented with an old serial number, then that's basically what it would be. So it'd be serial out of range or duplicate are based on when people do recreate the checks. They kind of got to guess a bit on the ranges.
So last year when I went to a bunch of conferences, and even this year, I keep having, it seems like everyone I talk to says we've got a check fraud problem. So I've got to believe that's good for you guys. Like, if someone, again, not necessarily specific to your solution, but could be specific to your solution, what's kind of a return on investment on, like, if you invest in the solutions to kind of catch these check frauds, like, how much, there's got to be a return on that investment. Like, does it take 2 minutes or 2 months to get that return on investment, 6 months to get that return on investment? I mean, it could be one check that comes through this $50,000, and if you don't catch it, that's 50,000. And then to your point, our point earlier, is if the actual cost of taking the investigation and making the customer right or the member right is really 4 times that amount, that's a $200,000 cost for the financial institution. So I've got to believe, and I don't know what your services cost or anyone else's services cost, but I would think that would be a pretty good return on investment to have those types of solutions. And the more financial institutions that have those sorts of solutions makes it more difficult for the fraudsters in general, eventually pushes them to look to something else, and check fraud hopefully goes away or is replaced by something else.
Larry, even if you were to just take, without even the loss, just the manpower of the amount of time that it spends going through checks to actually validate whether or not they're good checks or bad checks, that in itself usually pays for these things. And then those resources you can reallocate to revenue generating activities, because it's really about the it's about working smarter, not harder. And with the human eye, you can actually look at checks all day, but there's no way you're going to pick up any slight nuance that machine learning AI can actually pick up in no time at all. So it really is it's usually pretty much a no-brainer. But I'd say the costs come from 2 things. One is, it's the actual FTE. It is the direct loss of actually checks that come through there. And either one of those would actually usually make it up. And that's without looking at, your fraud mitigation costs, brand reputation damage, or anything else like that. If you're a really small bank and you don't write out any checks, obviously it doesn't make sense. But if your customer's writing out checks, and you don't have something in place, and it's not I don't think there's a silver bullet. It's about all the things you can do. So it's not just, have you got some great technology? Yes, but are your staff fully trained and aware? And are your customers fully trained and aware? And if they're writing out big checks, are they checking their deposits? Hey, I've written out a check, it's gone through. Let me look at my image on my phone and say, is that the check that I wrote out? Because I write out a Pico check for electricity, it's $450. Well, I'd see the $450 go off my account. I don't go back and check, is that actually the check that I wrote? Well,
right?
yeah. So, and I don't write out checks for them anymore. I pay them electronically, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah,
And so it's not a case of there's a silver bullet. It's, there are things in place that some banks are using, like positive pay. And positive pay, for example, is where you notify the bank that I'm a commercial customer. I'm going to be I've written out these checks today. Here are the serials. Here's the amount. Quite labor intensive, and I've got to the bank's got to receive those and say yes, this all works, but subject to human error. So is it effective? Yes, it can be if it's all followed and people do what they're supposed to do. But it's far better to actually get a bit of intelligence in there, that can actually automatically do the scanning, check out if there are any anomalies, and then you're only dealing with the exceptions. That allows you to check, all of the transactions that are coming through, and cuts down on your need for, your use of manpower quite considerably.
yeah, and I mean, AI pattern recognition it's amazing. You think about an example in kind of the medical field is they're finding that this AI is far better at finding cancer in like MRI scans than the best doctors, and it can go
Yeah,
through so many more scans so fast. Not only is it better at picking them out, but it can capture so many. And again, the manpower it would take or the person power it would take to go through all those scans would be outrageous. And so you think about something like a check, and you got 1,000 checks coming in a day or however many that is, and you're having a person physically look at each one of them and compare them against a known signature, like that's a lot of work, right? But if you could have that done with machine learning and AI, that's literally milliseconds. It's taking care of that, and the error rate is probably much, much lower.
that's exactly it.
Yeah.
Exactly it. Yeah.
Well,
And of
that
course, the profile learning, because each checks, whether it's a DDA or it's a HELOC account, every check's going to have different characteristics, and it's going to want to go to a different department in the bank. So the technology should automatically be able to split those up and send them to the right people, and allow them to handle any exceptions.
so it, neat solution. Just from your company standpoint, are there a lot of competitors in this space, or a lot of others that are doing the same thing? Are you early to the market with utilizing AI for this type of service? Do you focus primarily on fraud, but you also have some core and other businesses? Maybe can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's great. So fraud is obviously big and it's topical and solving a real problem. There are other companies that actually do it. Some of them are more behavioral based. Um, I think the image forensics is a bit newer. We're one of the few companies that actually do the dark web monitoring to be able to make sure that that information is available and make that available to the bank. But there are other companies doing it. Other areas of the business that we focus on is we focus on compliance as well. We have an AI compliance tool called Comply Pilot, which is really quite a phenomenal tool. It basically looks at all the regulations, all the regulatory bodies, and all the legislation that changes on those, and any updates that happens, and is able to actually understand those and update banks' policies and procedures, and act as a resident compliance officer. So you can really literally type anything into any compliance related question, and it'll answer it for you. And it also has got the ability to have a look at your bank's advertising, and have a look at the advert and tell you whether or not it meets all the compliance requirements. So really smart bit of technology, which in itself is a longer conversation. And we do core. So we acquired a core company called Modern Banking Systems out of Omaha, Nebraska, and one of their and their business down in Alabama. Modern Banking Systems, and we're really excited about that because they've got a great customer portfolio of really happy customers, and we are together with them are bringing out a lot of new technology solutions. So they're going to kind of go to a one-stop shop for fraud, compliance, payments, you name it. That's what we're doing. So
That's
very
that's an
excited.
actual core platform. That's not
Yes.
core integrated. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
All right, well, I know we had I've enjoyed this talk so much. I've totally like flaked out on asking the poll questions. We've got a couple polls. I'm hoping that maybe we can get those launched here. Victoria can help launch those. Let's see if she pulls those up.
Yeah, is there a specific one that you want to launch?
Let's launch them one at a time just to get
Okay.
some information for the group. We'll read out to everybody So the first poll was staying ahead of fraudsters. Do you believe FIs are doing enough to stay ahead of the fraudsters? So you have it, yeah, but yes, no, or somewhat. So somewhat, there's still significant room for improvement. No, fraudsters are moving faster than FIs can respond. Or yes, FIs are evolving quickly to combat fraud. So go ahead and vote. And Russell, you and I aren't allowed to vote on this one.
I just tried.
Trying to skew that poll. I get it. All right. So looks like most people said no, fraudsters are moving faster than FIs can respond. I think that's a lot of us would probably agree with that. It's a cat and mouse game. I think sometimes we catch up to the fraudsters and they leap ahead. 25% said yes, FIs are evolving quickly, outstanding for those FIs, and then 25% saying there's some significant room for improvement. Okay, let's close that poll and move to the next one. All right, this one's on fraud prevention strategy. What fraud prevention strategy does your FI prioritize most? So single choice, I'll read them out. The first one would be AI and machine learning for fraud detection, employee training and manual review process. So that sounds a little bit, Russell, what you're talking about, kind of the manual process. Customer or member education proactive alerts. That's a good one. Stronger authentication and transaction controls. And then there's an other option. If we didn't cover it, put in the chat. We got an all of above. Okay, that's a great answer there. Okay, people can answer. We'll see what the results were. All right, so interesting. So quarter AI and machine learning for fraud detection. So maybe an opportunity there. A 3/4 stronger authentication and transaction controls. So I assume by authentication, they're looking at that signature and looking at the signature size. That's how I would read that. Is that how you would have read that, Russell?
Yeah. I think that's probably looking at the thresholds that people will check above.
All right, a couple more polls here. Check fraud's biggest challenge. What do you see as the biggest challenge in combating check fraud today? Increasing sophistication of fraudsters, lack of real-time detection tools, cost of fraud prevention measures, or customer member awareness and education. So awareness and education, fraud prevention measures, lack of real-time detection tools, increasing sophistication of fraudsters. While we're waiting for the answer on that one, Russell, do you guys come across in the fraud scam business or any nation states involved? Like North Korea is very involved in the crypto hacks. Is there anything related to fraud that of any nation states that are kind of in that business?
Larry, on the check side, because checks are so much domestic, are there bad actors where the money's being transferred to crypto and being shipped out? Quite possibly, but I wouldn't say it's unlike crypto or cyber attacks that you can put it down to one particular organization. These are feet on the ground. Are they part of gangs that are owned internationally? Quite possibly, because a lot of the actors have got multiple lines of business, right?
Yeah.
So this is obviously all using local actors, local feet on the street, but could certainly be part of and are often part of more nefarious businesses.
All right, so this poll was check fraud's biggest challenge. 33% said increasing sophistication of fraudsters. Right, they're always kind of outrunning us. Lack of real-time detection tools, so opportunity there. Customer member awareness and education. Yeah, and I think that's an important one. Some of the things from a mail fraud standpoint, when I was looking at this stuff today, things that like we could all do is, to eliminate some of the things around check fraud is, deposit in your mail before the last pickup. So when the last pickup is, deposit it so it's not sitting in your mailbox very long or in the post office box very long. Retrieve your mail frequently, never leave it in your mailbox overnight. And then obviously, if you're going on vacation, have your mail held at the post office or picked up by a friend or neighbor. So a couple of things that, the average person can do to help minimize some of that check fraud. And then I think the last poll here, check fraud impact on trust. And we talked about this earlier, Russell, with trust. How much of an impact do you think check fraud has on customer or member trust in FIs? Single answer. I assume that's like, I can't see what the selections are there, Victoria, but I assume it's like a lot, a little, not so much, something like this. So
Yeah,
we'll see
so
what,
it's significant impact, moderate impact, and then minimal impact.
well, knowing that the true cost of check fraud is at least 4 times the dollar loss, and that doesn't include reputation, I suspect it's probably a lot. I'm leading the answers there, I'm sure. All right, so 40% significant, 40% moderate, 20% minimal. So 80% of you think moderate or significant impact on eroding trust and confidence, and that obviously impacts the broader business. All right, so that was it for our polls. Let's see if there's any questions from the group. This has been a fabulous conversation. Let's see if there are any questions. I think we had answered some of the earlier ones. And if anyone wants to come off mute, just raise your hand or put a note in the chat, and we'll take you off mute, and you can ask Russell a question or myself. I don't see any questions, so I am guessing you did a very good job, Russell, of covering these. Russell, is there a question that people should have asked that they didn't?
I'd say, is how quickly can you get rid of your checkbook?
Yeah, no kidding. I'm getting pretty good myself. I think what I write. I still write 1 or 2 checks, maybe 1 a month. So that's not a lot, right? And that one's that's a cross-border one. So yeah, if you're trying to steal checks out of my mailbox, good luck.
Well, it's actually funny with the mail. If we do post a check, we don't put check in our mail anymore. We'll go and drop it off at the post box.
You know what? I saw some pictures online today of fraudsters that had the postal keys actually getting them out of the mailboxes. And of course, that's a federal offense. Criminals may or may not know that, but that's a really big deal.
But you'd be surprised. I mean, there've been I was seeing some sentences in Canada where somebody was caught for the second offense, mail theft, and it was armed theft of mail guard, and he was given a 30-day suspended sentence. So I think that they've certainly in some areas maybe the disincentive for committing the crime is not actually that strong.
Well, hopefully that changes. Victoria posted a link to a good article that SRM has written about the rise of AI-enabled fraud. Look, Russell, I want to thank you. This has been a really fun conversation. I knew you and I were going to have a good talk. And for those of you that are interested in our next Perspective Live, that's going to be on April 10th. It's going to feature Mart Voss. We've actually had Mart as a guest before. He's the CEO of Eco Investments. And then one of his clients, Eric Carter, the SVP of Digital Solutions and Innovation Officer at Bank of New Hampshire. So want to thank our guest and all of you today for participating. We will have a recording of this, so we'll make it available if you have colleagues or anyone else that wants to share it. And we'll probably have that available by Monday or Tuesday of next week.
Fantastic. Larry, Victoria, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. And thanks for the time.
Likewise. Everyone have a great afternoon, evening. Take care.
Thanks.